Welcome back to the Bring Our Troops Home podcast and the Truth About Dick Cheney series. If you've been with me through this journey, thank you for coming back. We've covered a lot of ground together, and if you are just now finding us, I'm going to encourage you to go back and start from the beginning because this story builds on itself, and the weight of it actually is kind of important. In the last episode, we walked through how the Iraq War was sold. Colin Powell's credibility spent at the United Nations, Congress stepping aside instead of stepping up and doing their constitutional duty, the constitutional break that turned undeclared war from an exception into a habit. And by the end of episode 5, the machine had done its work. The war was no longer a question. It was an event on a calendar. But selling a war and living with its consequences are two very different things. This episode is about what came next. Not the invasion, not the initial swift military victory, but what came after, the part that doesn't fit on cable news chyrons. It's the part that doesn't get debated on Sunday shows. It's the part that landed on families and communities, on institutions, and an entire region of the world that is still burning 2 decades later. I also owe you some transparency. Again, I keep doing this, a little mea culpa before every episode, but when I started this project, I did plan 6 episodes. That's how I mapped it out. But the deeper I got into the material, the clearer it became that 6 was not enough. The consequences of Dick Cheney's doctrine don't fit neatly into a closing chapter. They spill over and they demand their own space. So this series is now 7 episodes. I promise 7's it. We're not going to go past 7. But this one, episode 6, this is about the blowback. It's about the foreign and domestic blowback. It's about the fires that Cheney's worldview lit across the Middle East and the quieter fires that burn inside of American institutions. The collapse of Iraq, the rise of ISIS, the normalization of torture, the surveillance state that never really went away, and the veterans who came home and realized that the story that they were told and the story that they lived simply didn't match. The fractures inside the Republican Party that most people still don't understand is a major fallout from the Dick Cheney saga. Episode 7 will be the human cost and the choice that remains. But before we get there, we have to see what the machine actually produced. If you believe in this work that we're doing, please follow us, share this episode, and if you're able, support what we're building at bringourtroopshome.us/donate. Now, let's talk about what happened when the bombs stopped falling and the real consequences began. The invasion itself was fast. 21 days from the first airstrikes to the fall of Baghdad. Shock and awe, rolling columns of armor, statues pulled down for the cameras. By the time President Bush landed on the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln beneath a banner reading "Mission Accomplished," the Pentagon was already calling it a model campaign. And in the narrowest of all military senses, I guess it was. The Iraq military collapsed, Saddam's government evaporated, coalition forces controlled the capital. American troops were swimming in Saddam's swimming pool, sleeping in his bed, drinking his expensive liquor. And the mission had been to remove Saddam Hussein from power. I guess the mission was accomplished. But that was never really the mission. The real mission, the one the Cheney Circle had been planning since the 1990s, was transformation. Regime change was just the opening act. And what followed was supposed to be the construction of a new Iraq, a client state in the heart of the Middle East, a demonstration of American power that would ripple outward and reshape the entire region. That transformation required a plan. And the plan that they had was catastrophic. Within weeks of Baghdad falling, President Bush appointed L. Paul Bremer. He was supposed to lead the coalition provincial authority. Bremer arrived in Iraq with essentially unlimited power over the shattered country. He answered to Rumsfeld. He carried Cheney's worldview in his briefcase. And in his first month on the ground, he issued 2 orders that guaranteed everything that followed. The first was the Coalition Provincial Authority Order number 1, de-Baathification. I want you to remember that. It's very important. On paper, this was about removing Saddam loyalists from positions of power. In practice, it was just a purge. The Ba'ath Party had been the only legal political organization in Iraq for decades. If you wanted to be a teacher, you joined the party. If you wanted to be a doctor, you joined the party. And if you wanted to run a water treatment plant or manage a hospital or work in any level of government, you joined the party. Bremer's order didn't distinguish between believers and bureaucrats. It swept out tens of thousands of administrators, professionals, and civil servants in a single stroke. The people who knew how to keep the lights on, how to run the schools, how to manage the ministries, gone. Iraq's government didn't just change hands, it actually ceased to exist. The second order was actually, believe it or not, worse. Coalition Provincial Authority Order Number 2. It dissolved the Iraqi military. Face value, that sounds legitimate. We don't want to reform the military. They didn't want to reorganize it. They actually dissolved it. Overnight, somewhere between 250,000 and 400,000 Iraqi soldiers were out of a job. We're talking about trained military-age men, armed men, men with families to feed, and now no income. Men who knew how to fight, they knew how to organize, they knew how to move weapons and personnel. Men who, until that very morning, had a place in the social order. But Bremer's order didn't just fire them, it humiliated them. It told them that their service meant nothing. It told them that the new Iraq had no place for them. And then it sent them home with their anger and their skills, and in many cases, their weapons. This was not incompetence. This was ideology. The neoconservative theory of transformation required a clean break, a blank slate. The old Iraq had to be completely erased before the new Iraq could be built. Bremer and his advisors believed that they could impact democracy the way you import machinery. Remove the old parts, install the new ones, turn it back on and watch it run. Anybody who's been paying attention, they were wrong. What they created was actually a vacuum, a void, and vacuums do not stay empty. Within months, the insurgency began. Former soldiers who had been cast aside found new purpose fighting the occupation. Sunni communities that had held power under Saddam were suddenly excluded from the new order and had every reason to resist it. Networks that had been dormant were activated. Weapons caches that had been abandoned were reopened. The men Bremer fired didn't disappear. They just reorganized. And the country that Bremer was supposed to stabilize became absolutely ungovernable. This is the part of the story that Washington still doesn't want to face and they won't talk about. The chaos in Iraq was not an accident. It was not the fog of war. It was not the inevitable messiness of regime change. It was the direct, predictable, and predicted result of decisions made by people who believed ideology mattered more than reality. Military leaders warned against disbanding the Iraqi army. State Department planners warned that de-Baathification would gut the civil service. Intelligence analysts warned that the occupation would face armed resistance if the population felt humiliated and excluded. Those warnings, they were ignored. Not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient. Cheney's circle wanted transformation, and transformation required destruction first. They got what they wanted. They broke Iraq so completely that it could not be reassembled. And then they acted surprised when the pieces started to fight back. The men who planned this war believed that they were engineers. They believed they could dismantle a society and rebuild it according to the blueprint drawn up in a Washington think tank. But what they actually did was light a fire and then pour gas and then more gas. And that fire didn't stay inside of Iraq's borders. It spread to the prisons. It spread to the militias. It spread across the region. It spread into something no one in Washington wanted to name, something that would make every justification for the war collapse under its own weight. A force that was so brutal, so organized, and so directly traceable to the decisions made in 2003 that it would haunt American foreign policy for a generation. The men who sold the Iraq war told Americans it would make them safer. They said Saddam Hussein was a threat. They said that his weapons programs endangered the world. They said his removal would stabilize the region and drain the swamp that bred terrorism. But none of that happened. What happened instead was the creation of the most dangerous terrorist organization in modern history, an army that did not exist before the invasion, an army that could not have existed without it. ISIS, it didn't emerge from a cave in Afghanistan. It was born in the rubble of Iraq. The story starts in the chaos that Bremer created. And when the Iraqi military was dissolved and the government gutted, a power vacuum opened up across the country, and into that vacuum poured every faction with a grievance, a weapon, and an opportunity. Sunni insurgents, Shia militias, criminal networks, foreign fighters, and one man who saw the moment more clearly than anybody else: Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Zarqawi was a Jordanian jihadist who had been operating on the margins of the global terror network for years. Before the invasion, he had no significant presence in Iraq. Saddam's secular government had no use for him. But once that government was gone, Zarqawi moved in. He founded al-Qaeda in Iraq. He built it out of exactly the materials that Bremer had scattered all across the country. Former Iraqi soldiers who knew how to fight, former intelligence officers who knew how to organize, former Baathists who had the skills to run an insurgency and the rage to fuel it. Zarqawi gave them a flag, he gave them a mission, he gave them an identity, and he gave them permission to be as brutal as they wanted, beyond anything the region had ever seen. His strategy was deliberate. He didn't just attack American forces, he attacked Shia civilians. He bombed mosques. He massacred communities. He wanted sectarian war. He believed that if he could provoke the Shia majority into retaliating against Sunnis, he could radicalize the Sunni population and position his movement as their only protector. And it worked. The Iraqi government, dominated by Shia politicians with their own grudges, responded with militias and death squads. Sunni neighborhoods were targeted, bodies appeared in the streets, families fled, trust collapsed, and every cycle of violence, Zarqawi recruitment grew. This is the part the Americans were never told clearly. The invasion didn't disrupt a terrorist network. It created the conditions for one to metastasize. Zarqawi was killed by an American airstrike in 2006, but the organization he built did not die with him. It evolved, it rebranded, it became the Islamic State of Iraq. And when Syrian civil war cracked open a second failed state next door, it became ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. A terrorist army with tanks, with territory, with oil revenue, with a propaganda machine that recruited fighters from across the globe, with the administrative capacity to run cities, collect taxes, and impose brutal theocratic order on millions of people. And none of this was possible without the Iraq War. The disbanded soldiers became the military backbone of ISIS. The shattered institutions left nobody to resist, and the sectarian wounds provided endless recruits, and the American occupation provided the recruiting narrative. Every element of the catastrophe fed the next. And here's the fact that should haunt every single person who supported the war. By the time ISIS reached its peak, it controlled more territory than Great Britain and its current empire. It conducted or inspired terrorist attacks across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the United States. It burned men alive in cages. It enslaved women. It beheaded journalists on camera and then broadcast the footage to the entire world. This is what the war produced. Not safety or stability, not democracy, but a monster. This is what Dick Cheney's Doctrine built. Not the elimination of a threat, but the incubation of one. And every decision that his circle made, from disbanding the army to gutting the civil service to ignoring every warning, created the conditions for ISIS to rise. The monster did not emerge despite the invasion. It emerged because of it. The men who planned the invasion told Americans that removing Saddam would eliminate a threat. But instead, it created a threat orders of magnitude worse. Saddam Hussein, for all of his brutality, was a contained problem. He was sanctioned, he was surveilled, he was boxed in. He had no ability to project power beyond his own borders. He was not planning attacks on American soil. ISIS was. The war that was sold as a response to terrorism became the single greatest accelerant of terrorism in the 21st century. The logic that justified the invasion, that America had to act before threats fully formed, produced exactly the threat it claimed to prevent. And the cost of defeating that threat, the second war, the airstrikes, the ground advisors, the Kurdish alliance, the Syrian spillover, the years of grinding urban combat to retake Mosul and dozens of other cities, that cost was never added to the original invoice. Washington doesn't like to connect those lines. They prefer to treat ISIS as a separate problem, a new challenge, an unfortunate development that required a new response. But it wasn't separate. It wasn't new. It was the direct consequence of decisions made in 2003 by men who believed they could break a country and rebuild it in their own image. They broke it. They never rebuilt it. And the fire that they started did not stop at Iraq's borders. It jumped into Syria. It flooded Jordan and Lebanon with refugees. It pulled Iran deeper into the region. It handed Russia an opening it had not had in decades. It destabilized allies. It empowered enemies. And it turned the entire Middle East into a proving ground for every consequence the architects of the war swore would never come. The architects of Iraq war believed in a theory. They called it transformation. The idea was simple: remove Saddam Hussein, install a friendly government, and watch the shockwaves ripple outward. Democracy would spread, authoritarian regimes would weaken, the Middle East would be remade in America's image, and American power would be the catalyst. We would import democracy and freedom and baseball and apple pie. They were right about the shockwaves, but they were wrong about everything else. The instability that consumed Iraq did not stay inside of Iraq. It radiated outward in every direction. It crossed borders. It empowered enemies. It destabilized allies. It turned an entire region into a chain reaction of collapse that is still unfolding 2 decades later. Let's start with Syria. When ISIS spilled across the Syrian border, it didn't enter a stable country. Syria was already fracturing under the pressures of the Arab Spring and the Assad regime's brutal crackdowns. But ISIS accelerated the collapse. It seized territory. It drew in foreign fighters. It created a second front in a civil war that had already displaced millions. The Syrian conflict became a magnet for every competing interest in the region. Iran propped up Assad in Syria. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states backed the rebel factions. Turkey intervened to block Kurdish expansion. Russia entered to protect its own client and to project power in the region. And the United States, still cleaning up the mess it made in Iraq, found itself navigating a web of conflicting alliances that it couldn't control. At one point in the Syrian conflict, the United States and its intelligence apparatus was supporting or funding every side of the four-way conflict. American dollars shooting at American dollars. And none of it was inevitable. Syria had problems before Iraq, but the vacuum next door, the flood of weapons, the jihadist networks that metastasized in the chaos, those were imports. They arrived because Iraq had been broken and nobody could contain what crawled out of that mess. The refugee crisis followed. Millions of people fled. They poured into Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey. They crossed the Mediterranean in overcrowded boats. They died on beaches. They overwhelmed European border systems and sparked political crisis that reshaped the elections across the continent. The migration pressures that fueled the populist movements in Europe, the border crisis debates, the rise of nationalist parties in Europe. None of that happened without the wars that emptied the Middle East of its people. Entire generations were displaced. Children who grew up in camps, families who were separated across continents, communities that would never be rebuilt. That's what transformation actually looked like. And ISIS wasn't the end of the pattern, it was the template for it. ISIS-K in Afghanistan and Pakistan, Al-Shabaab in East Africa, Al-Qaeda affiliates spreading across the Sahel in Africa, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Boko Haram that grew up in Nigeria, each one growing in the same soil, weak states, unresolved grievances, foreign intervention that broke things without fixing them. The monster that Cheney's war created learned how to reproduce, and it no longer needed the incubation in Baghdad. It just needed instability, and instability was the one thing that the war never stopped producing. There was Iran. Before the invasion, Iran was boxed in. Saddam Hussein, for all of his horrors, served as a counterweight. The Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s had bled both countries, and neither could dominate the region while the other stood. The invasion removed that counterweight overnight. The Shia-led government that replaced Saddam had deep ties to Tehran. Iranian influence flooded into Iraq through militias, political parties, and economic networks. The country America invaded to project power became the corridor for Iranian expansion. This was not an unintended consequence. It was a predictable one. Analysts warned before the invasion that removing Saddam would empower Iran. Those warnings were ignored, just like every other warning that conflicted with the theory. The neoconservatives wanted transformation, but what they got was the opposite. Instead of democracy spreading outward from Baghdad, chaos spread outward. Instead of American influence expanding, it contracted. Instead of rivals weakened, they were strengthened. Iran gained a client state. Russia gained a foothold in Syria. China watched and took notes on the limits of American power. The war that was supposed to demonstrate unchallengeable American dominance demonstrated something else entirely. It showed the world that the United States could break countries, but it could not rebuild them. That it could topple a government, but it couldn't manage what came next. That its power, however overwhelming on the battlefield, had limits that ideology refused to recognize. Folks, this is Dick Cheney's Middle East. Not the one that he promised us, it's the one that he built. The theory said that American power could remake the world. The reality has said otherwise. And the people who paid the price were not the architects in the Washington think tanks. They were the families in Mosul and Aleppo and 100 other places that most Americans will never visit. But the wreckage was not limited to geography. The same worldview that shattered Iraq, the same conviction that American power operated beyond ordinary limits, the same certainty that the threat justified any response, that worldview did not stay confined to foreign policy. It seeped into how the government treated human beings in its custody. It corrupted institutions that were supposed to operate under the law. And in April of 2004, photographs leaked from a prison that showed the world exactly what happened when power believes that it answers to nobody. In April 2004, photographs leaked from a prison called Abu Ghraib. Americans saw images that they were not supposed to see. Naked prisoners stacked in pyramids, hooded men standing on boxes with wires attached to their bodies, soldiers grinning next to corpses, dogs lunging at cowering detainees. Humiliation was the policy, and cruelty was the routine. The official response was swift, and it was carefully constructed. These were bad apples, just a few rogue soldiers, an aberration, not representative of American values or American policy. They told us. That was a lie, because Abu Ghraib was not an aberration. It was the outcome, the logical endpoint of decisions made at the highest levels of the Bush administration, in offices where Dick Cheney's influence was the strongest, by lawyers who believed the president's war powers placed him beyond any legal restraint. And the torture, it did not begin in that prison. It began in Washington. 5 days after September 11th, Dick Cheney sat down with Tim Russert on Meet the Press. It was national television. The rubble was still smoking, and Cheney, in that calm, measured, gruff voice, told the country exactly what was coming.
We also have to work, though, sort of the dark side, if you will. We've got to spend time in the shadows and in the intelligence world. A lot of what needs to be done here will have to be done quietly, without any discussion, using sources and methods that are available to our intelligence agencies, if we're going to be successful. That's the world these folks operate in. And so it's going to be vital for us to use any means at our disposal, basically, to achieve our objective.
That's not rhetoric. That's guidance. And David Addington, remember Cheney's personal lawyer, made sure that it had legal cover. Addington, along with Justice Department lawyers John Yoo and Jay Bybee, produced a series of memoranda that redefined what United States could do to human beings in its custody. The memos argued that the president's commander-in-chief authority was essentially unlimited in wartime. They argued that techniques causing severe pain could still fall short of the legal definition of torture. They created categories and loopholes and definitions so narrow that almost anything could be justified. Waterboarding, stress positions, sleep deprivation, temperature extremes, sensory overload, mock executions. These are not rogue tactics invented by a low-level interrogator or some bad apple National Guard soldier. They were approved techniques. They were authorized methods. Guys, they were goddamn policy. The administration called it enhanced interrogations. The rest of the world, we called it what it was. And the physical abuse was only part of it. The CIA operated a network of secret prisons scattered across the globe, black sites, places where detainees could be held indefinitely outside of any legal framework, beyond the reach of courts or lawyers or international observers. Men were rendered, which is just a clean word for being kidnapped. They were transported to countries where torture was routine. Others simply disappeared in the system and were held for years without any charges. This is not because of the fog of war. This was the architecture. Cheney's theory of executive power had always held that the presidency should operate without any meaningful constraint in matters of national security. The war on terror gave that theory a laboratory. And what emerged from that laboratory was a government that believed it could do literally anything to anyone as long as it labeled them an enemy combatant. The physical torture was devastating, but the institutional corruption that followed may actually be worse. Agencies that were supposed to operate within the law were asked to operate just outside of it. Career professionals who raised objections were sidelined. Lawyers who questioned the memos were replaced. A culture of impunity took root. And once the culture exists, it doesn't stay confined to those black sites overseas. Daniel Ellsberg spent his career studying how governments lie to themselves. He understood from his experience with the Pentagon Papers and Vietnam that deception does not begin as malice. It begins as convenience. Officials tell themselves that the lie is temporary, the exception is necessary, the emergency justifies the deviation, and then the lie becomes habit, the exception becomes policy, and the emergency becomes permanent. Ellsberg saw it happen in Vietnam. He watched a government convince itself that classified lies were necessary for national security and that the public could not be trusted with the truth, that deception was not corruption, but prudence. And he watched those patterns repeat almost exactly in the years after September 11th. And that's exactly what happened with torture. The Bush administration told itself these techniques were necessary. It told itself that the threat justified the methods. It told itself that the legal memos provided cover. And by the time the photographs leaked, the institution had already absorbed the corruption. The question was no longer whether torture was wrong. The question was how to manage the public relations. And the surveillance state was part of that project. Not a reluctant response to emergency, a deliberate restoration of executive power that Cheney had been seeking for 30 years. This wasn't an improvisation, it was a completion. That young chief of staff who watched the church committee constrain executive powers in 1975 had spent the last 3 decades waiting for the moment when he could tear those constraints down. And September 11th gave him that moment, and he didn't waste it. Glenn Greenwald later described what Cheney's project actually produced. If the president is allowed to get away with secretly decreeing that he can violate the law and then doing exactly that, then there really is no remaining checks on executive power. And we have, without hyperbole, arrived at the very definition of tyranny. That was not rhetorical exaggeration. That was a clinical diagnosis. And the institutions that were supposed to push back did not push back. That lesson did not stay inside the intelligence community. It radiated outward. It shaped how institutions understood their own limits. It taught bureaucracies that emergency authority, once claimed, rarely gets surrendered. It taught future administrations that the precedent was set and the public would tolerate more than anybody actually expected. Cheney's defenders argued that the programs kept America safe. But the Senate Intelligence Committee's own 5-year investigation based on 6.3 million pages of CIA records concluded just the opposite. The enhanced techniques produced little actionable intelligence and often generated false information from detainees willing to say anything to make the pain stop. Glenn Greenwald, whose reporting on civil liberties and government overreach made him one of the sharpest critics of the post-9/11 security state. He put it bluntly when he said, "This was never a policy dispute. These are war crimes, among the most atrocious war crimes. The decision not to prosecute anybody sent a message that torture was, at worst, a policy error. And that message gave Cheney permission to spend the rest of his life defending what he had built without ever facing consequences for it. But even if Cheney's safety claim was true, it would not change what the programs revealed. A government willing to torture is a government that has decided its power matters more than its principles. And that decision didn't stay overseas. The same emergency logic that justified black sites in Poland and Thailand, that justified waterboarding in secret rooms, that justified legal memos designed to make cruelty disappear into euphemism, that logic followed the power home. It reshaped what the government believed it could do to its own citizens. It built systems of surveillance that would have been unthinkable before September 11th. And it did so in quiet, secret ways. While the Americans were told the only thing being sacrificed was the privacy of terrorists. You've heard the phrase, never let a crisis go to waste. Well, just 6 weeks after September 11th, Congress passed the USA Patriot Act. The name is a backronym. You start with the word first that you want to use, and then you reverse engineer a phrase to fit. Congress is really good at it. They've turned it into an art form. Think of some of the most recent ones. The CARES Act, Coronavirus, Aid, Relief, and Economic Security. The HEROES Act, Health and Economic Recovery Omnibus Emergency Solutions. The DREAM Act, Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors. Amber Alert, America's Missing, Broadcast Emergency Response. But that one was named after Amber Hagerman, a real child. They reverse engineered a phrase to match her name, and so I'm kind of okay with that one. But the pattern is always the same. Pick a word that sounds heroic, patriotic, or emotionally unchallengeable. Then stretch a phrase until it fits the letters, no matter how awkward it becomes. It's legislative branding designed to make voting no feel like kicking a puppy. And just 6 weeks after September 11th, they gave us the USA Patriot Act, uniting and strengthening America by providing the appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism. Whoa, beautiful. 342 pages long. Most members of Congress, they didn't read it before they voted. The pressure to act was overwhelming. Who's going to vote against USA Patriot? Fear was fresh. And the bill passed the Senate 98-1. Senator Russ Feingold of Wisconsin cast the only vote against it. He warned that the law was too broad, that it gave the government sweeping surveillance powers with insufficient oversight, that the emergency of the moment would become the permanent architecture of the future. He was dismissed as naive, reckless, and out of step with the gravity of the threat. But he was right about everything. The Patriot Act did not sunset. It renewed, it expanded, it normalized. The emergency powers that it granted became the baseline, and the surveillance state it authorized grew far beyond even what its critics initially imagined. In 2005, the New York Times revealed that the National Security Agency, our own NSA, had been conducting warrantless wiretapping of American citizens. The program operated outside of the framework of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA. It had been authorized in secret, justified by the same theories of executive power that Cheney and Addington have been championing since the Ford administration. The revelation should have been a scandal that ended careers. But instead, it was just absorbed by the blob. The administration argued the program was necessary, that Congress then eventually passed legislation that would retroactively immunize telecommunication companies that had cooperated. The legal framework was adjusted to accommodate what had already been done. Isn't that convenient? And the surveillance continued. This is the pattern that Glenn Greenwald spent years documenting. Greenwald, the journalist who would later help expose the full scope of the NSA surveillance through the Edward Snowden disclosures, understood something essential about how emergency powers work. They do not announce themselves as permanent. They arrive wrapped in necessity, they promise to be temporary, and then they just stay like an unwanted house guest. Greenwald's central insight was simple. If you do not build a surveillance state by announcing that you're building a surveillance state. You build it by telling citizens each expansion is temporary, it's targeted, and it's essential. And by the time they realize what's been constructed, dismantling it becomes unthinkable. That observation is the key to understanding what happened to the American civil liberties after September 11th. The threat of terrorism did not disappear. It couldn't disappear. It was, by definition, an ongoing condition. There would always be plots. There would always be suspects. There would always be a reason to maintain the tools, and so the tools remained. The Snowden disclosures in 2013 revealed the full architecture. The NSA was collecting metadata on virtually every single phone call made or received inside the United States. It was accessing the servers of major technology companies. It was tapping undersea cables. It was vacuuming up emails, text messages, and internet traffic on a scale that made the original Patriot Act look modest. And almost none of it required a traditional warrant. The FISA court, which was supposed to provide judicial oversight, operated in secret and approved almost every single request the government made. The legal interpretations that justified the programs were classified. The American public was told that the program existed only in the most general terms, and often not even that. This is not what we were promised. When the Patriot Act passed, supporters said it was about connecting dots, that it was about letting agencies share information. It was about making sure the failures that led to September 11th couldn't happen again. They did not say it was about building a permanent infrastructure for mass surveillance of American citizens. That's exactly what it became. And the logic that justified it is the same logic that justified torture, the same logic that justified indefinite detention, the same logic that justified the Iraq war itself. The threat is just too grave. The stakes are just too high. Normal rules, they don't apply to the situation. And once that logic takes hold, it doesn't let go. Cheney understood this better than anybody. He had been arguing since the 1970s that the presidency had been weakened by reforms passed after Watergate and Vietnam. He believed that Frank Church and his Frank Church Committee investigations, which exposed real CIA abuses and led to a new oversight requirements, that had crippled American intelligence. September 11th gave him the opportunity to reverse those reforms and to build the presidency that he believed America needed. The surveillance state was part of that project. It wasn't a reluctant response to an emergency. It was a deliberate restoration of executive power that Cheney had been seeking for 30 years. The Church Committee had built these walls for a reason. Cheney had been trying to tear them down ever since, and now, with the country still in shock and Congress desperate to act, 16 days later, nobody was going to push back, and nobody was going to stop him. Congress renewed the authorities again. Courts deferred to the executive claims of national security. The press, with very few exceptions, treated the programs as necessary and their critics as paranoid. The public, exhausted and afraid, accepted the trade-off that it was offered. Benjamin Franklin warned us that this exact moment was coming more than 2 centuries ago. He said, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." But the trade-off was never honestly presented. Americans were not told what they were giving up. They were not told how much was being collected or how it was being used or how long it would be retained. They were asked to trust institutions that had already demonstrated that they could not be trusted. And the emergency never ended. 20 years later, the architecture remains. The program continues. The authorities persist. The surveillance state built in the panic after September 11th, 2001 has become a permanent feature of American life. That is what emergency powers do. They arrive as exceptions and they stay as infrastructure. The people who built this system told Americans it was necessary. The people who maintained it told Americans it was temporary. The people who expanded it told Americans it was targeted. And through all of it, the people who actually lived inside the system, the veterans who deployed overseas under its stolen and unchecked authorities, came home carrying its weight. And they began to see something that Cheney and his architects never intended them to see. The gap between what they were told, what they were sold, and what they experienced. The distance between the mission they believed in and the machinery that they served. The slow, corrosive realization that the story did not hold together. The soldiers who came home knew something was wrong before anybody told them. It wasn't one thing. It was an accumulation, small details that didn't fit the story. Gaps between what they were told and what they saw. Questions that started as observations, then whispers, and then grew louder the longer that they sat with them. They had deployed believing the mission was necessary. They had trusted the chain of command. They assumed that the people making the decisions in Washington understood things that they could not see from the ground. That's how it's supposed to work. You don't get the full picture at the squad level. You trust that someone above you has it. But that picture never came into focus. The weapons of mass destruction, they weren't there. The connection to September 11, it wasn't there. The grateful population that was supposed to greet us as liberators, they weren't there. The exit strategy, it wasn't there. The victory that was supposed to follow the invasion kept receding into the distance, replaced by new rationales, new timelines, new definitions of progress, but never success. The things that were there didn't match the mission that they had been sold. They saw contractors everywhere, not support personnel in the rear areas, but contractors forward, contractors armed, contractors doing the jobs that used to belong to soldiers at salaries soldiers would never see. They saw convoys running supplies for companies whose names they recognized from the news. They saw bases built by private firms, maintained by private firms, and fed by private firms. They saw the money. It wasn't in their paychecks, though. It was in the infrastructure around them, in the deals that didn't add up, in the equipment that arrived broken, and the repairs that never came, and the stories that filtered through the ranks about contracts worth billions awarded without any competition, about invoices being paid twice or 3 times or 12 times, about shipments billed and never delivered, about a system designed to move cash more efficiently than it moved ammunition. Halliburton, KBR, Blackwater, the names became part of the vocabulary. And one of those names traced directly back to Vice President's office. Dick Cheney had been Halliburton's CEO. During the time of his vice presidency, he still held deferred compensation from the company. The war he architected had made his former employer billions of dollars. Veterans didn't need a congressional investigation to see the connection. They didn't need a forensic audit. They saw it every time a KBR truck rolled past their position. They saw it in the brand new facilities that contractors occupied while military units made do with the equipment held together by tape and improvisation. They saw it in the math because it didn't add up. The priorities didn't make sense in a war that seemed to serve interests that had nothing to do with the mission brief that they had just had. And the veterans who served next to these contractors, who watched them operate, who sometimes depended on them and oftentimes had to clean up after them, started asking questions that didn't have comfortable answers. Why were private security forces making 5 times what a sergeant made to do the same job in the same city? Why were supply chains that couldn't keep units equipped somehow generating record profits for the companies that were running them? Why did reconstruction projects cost fortune and produce nothing but rubble? Why did the mission keep changing while the money kept flowing? The fraud was not hidden. It was documented. Auditors found billions in waste. Inspectors general issued reports that disappeared into filing cabinets. Journalists published investigations that briefly trended and then were forgotten. Congressional hearings produced testimony, outrage, and then nothing else. The Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction spent years cataloging these failures. Contracts with no oversight. Projects abandoned, halfway finished. Equipment purchased and never used. Schools built and never occupied. Billions unaccounted for. The reports were public. They were damning, and they changed nothing. This is what the veterans came home to. Not just the personal weight of what they had seen and what they had done, but the slow realization that the enterprise itself was rotten. That the war they fought had been sold on intelligence that was manipulated, justified by threats that didn't exist, and executed in a way that enriched contractors while grinding down the men and women who wore the uniform. That realization does not arrive all at once. It builds a story on the news that confirms a suspicion, a document that surfaces years later, a memoir from an insider that says out loud what everyone on the ground already knows, a Senate report that lays out the lies and bureaucratic detail, each piece clicking together and falling into place, and the picture becomes impossible to unsee. Some veterans processed this quietly. They filed it away. They moved on. They didn't talk about it because talking about it meant confronting something too big to hold. But others couldn't let it go. They started asking why the war happened, why the warnings were ignored, why no one was held accountable, why the same people who got it wrong kept showing up on television as experts, why the system that produced this disaster faced no consequences while the men and women who executed it carried the weight alone. Those questions, they did not stay inside the veteran community. They bled into families, into churches, into small towns that had guard units overseas and watched them come home changed. It bled into communities that had trusted the government and felt that trust break. And slowly the questions found their way into politics. Not from the expected places, not from the anti-war left, which had opposed the invasion from the beginning and could be dismissed as partisan. Questions came from inside the house, from conservatives, from Republicans, from people who had supported the war, believed in the mission, and slowly came to understand that they'd been lied to. That fracture inside the right is one of the most important and least understood consequences of the Iraq War, because it didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen loudly, but it happened. And it would reshape American politics in ways the architects of the war never anticipated, and the party establishment spent years trying to suppress it. For most of the Bush years, opposition to the Iraq War was coded as a Democratic position. The anti-war left had marched before the invasion. They had protested throughout the occupation. And because they had, the Republican establishment could dismiss war skepticism as partisan noise, as weakness dressed up as principle, and as the same people who always blamed America first. It was an easy position to take. And that framing had held for a while, but it couldn't survive contact with reality. Inside the Republican Party, a quieter dissent was building. It started at the margins. A congressman here, a columnist there, old school conservatives who remembered when the right was suspicious of foreign entanglements, not addicted to them. Libertarians who had never trusted the national security state. Veterans who had seen the gap between the rhetoric and the rubble. Congressman Ron Paul was the earliest and most consistent voice. The Texas congressman had voted against the Iraq war authorization in 2002. He had warned that the invasion would destabilize the region, empower Iran, drain American resources for a generation. He was dismissed as a crank, an isolationist, a man out of step with the party and the moment. But Dr. Paul, he kept talking. And by 2007 and 2008, when he ran for president, something had shifted. The crowds that showed up to hear him, they weren't left-wing activists. They were young conservatives, libertarians, veterans, people who supported the war initially and then watched it fail. People had started asking questions that Dr. Paul had been asking all along. In his presidential campaign, Congressman Paul received more individual donors and dollars from veterans and members who had served in the global war on terror than all the other candidates on both sides in both parties combined. That's something. But Dr. Paul didn't win. He was never going to win. The Republican establishment was not ready to abandon the war or the worldview that produced it. But he proved something important. The dissent was real. It had an audience, and it wasn't going away. What Dr. Paul represented in 2008 was a fracture that the party spent years trying to ignore. The old coalition, the fusion of fiscal conservatives, social conservatives, and the national security hawks, they'd held together through the Cold War era and into the war on terror. But Iraq stressed that coalition to its limit because the war had not delivered what it promised. It had not made America safer. It had not stabilized the region. It hadn't demonstrated what American power could achieve. It had demonstrated just the opposite. And the conservatives who cared about balanced budgets watched trillions of dollars disappear in the sand. The conservatives who cared about limited government watched the surveillance state expand. The conservatives who cared about constitutional restraint watched the executive branch claim powers that the founders never even imagined. The neoconservatives, they told us that This was strength. Cheney's defenders insisted that the programs had kept America safe. The party establishment demanded loyalty to a legacy that was already collapsing under the weight of its own failures. It didn't feel like strength. It sure as hell didn't. It felt like we were being lied to. And by the time Donald Trump ran for president in 2016, the fracture was impossible to hide. Trump, on the debate stage right in front of Jeb Bush, he called the Iraq war a disaster. He said it openly on the Republican debate stage to an audience of Republican voters. He was not punished for it. He was rewarded. The base was supposed to be hawkish. It was supposed to revere the Bush legacy. It was supposed to reject any criticism of the war on terror, but they didn't. They cheered. That moment revealed what the party establishment had refused to see. The base had moved, but the elites, they had not. And in the years that followed, this skepticism spread further into conservative media. Voices that had once been reliably hawkish began asking different questions. Tucker Carlson, then at the peak of his influence at Fox News, used his platform to challenge the assumptions that had driven American foreign policy for 2 decades. He asked why the United States was still in Syria. He asked who benefited from endless deployments. He asked why the same experts who had gotten everything wrong were still treated as authorities. He asked on national television the questions that veterans had been asking in private for years. Tucker, he was not the originator. He was not a theorist. He was a societal indicator. When the most watched host of cable news is questioning the war consensus, the consensus is already collapsed. Tucker didn't create the doubt, he reflected it. He proved that skepticism of permanent war had reached an audience far beyond the margins where it had been exiled for years. The revolt inside the right was not a single event. It was a slow motion realignment. A generation of conservatives looked at what the Iraq war had produced and decided they didn't want it. Some blamed the intelligence community. Some blamed the neocons. Some blamed Dick Cheney directly. The man whose fingerprints were on every element of the catastrophe, from the intelligence manipulation to the torture memos to the contracts that enriched the former company that he worked for while soldiers bled. But almost all of them reached the same conclusion. The war had been a mistake, and the people who sold it had never been held accountable. And that realization didn't produce a single leader or a unified movement. It produced a shift in gravity, a change in what Republican voters were willing to tolerate and what they were willing to question. And it left the country in a strange and unstable place. The old consensus was dead, but the machinery it built kept running on autopilot, and the authorizations remained on the books, and the contracts, they kept flowing, the bases, they stayed open, the drones, they kept flying, and the men who built the system retired to think tanks and corporate boardrooms, while a new generation inherited the wreckage without ever being asked if they wanted it. The machine, it kept running. Not because anybody believed in it anymore, but because nobody had figured out how to turn the damn thing off. So this is the world that Dick Cheney's doctrine built. Not a world that he promised. It's not the world that the think tanks sketched on whiteboards. It's not the world that the Sunday show pundits described in confident tones. The actual world, the one that we live in today, 2025. It's a Middle East more unstable than it was before the invasion, a terrorist threat that metastasized instead of being contained, a region emptied of millions of refugees who washed up on foreign shores and changed the politics of continents. An Iran strengthened rather than weakened, a Russia emboldened rather than deterred, and a China watching from the perimeter, learning what American overreach looks like. At home, a surveillance architecture that never went away, and emergency powers that became permanent fixtures. And I want to ask you this, ask yourself this. Do you believe that the COVID emergency powers would have been wielded the way that they were if we hadn't already spent 20 years being conditioned to accept that emergencies justify anything? The executive orders, the mandates, the suspension of normal legislative process, none of that was new. It was inherited. The muscle memory of unchecked emergency authority didn't start in 2020 with COVID. It started in 2001 with Dick Cheney. Cheney's doctrine taught the government that crisis means permission. And the government, they never forget that lesson. Now we have a torture program that was documented. It was investigated, never punished. Institutions learned that they could break the rule as long as they wrapped the breach in the language of security. A public that was asked to trade liberty for safety, but never told how much it was going to cost. That's what 20 years of permanent war produces. Not victory, not defeat, but something worse. Numbness. Because the wars didn't end, they faded into the background as noise. The country stopped paying attention, not because the wars became less costly, but because the cost became normal. And that's the final crowning achievement of the Cheney Doctrine. It made endless war boring. It removed the friction that is supposed to slow a republic down before it commits its sons and daughters to combat. It bypassed the debates. It eliminated the votes. It turned war into a permanent condition managed by professionals and ignored by everybody else. The machine is still running. Different presidents have sat in the Oval Office and different parties have controlled Congress and different names have cycled through the Pentagon, but the architecture remains, the authorizations remain, and the assumptions, they all remain. And the weight, unfortunately, falls on people who never asked for it. It's definitely not falling on the policymakers who retired to comfortable lives. It's not falling on the lawyers who wrote the memos and moved on. It's not falling on the pundits who got everything wrong and kept their platforms. The weight falls on the Guard members and the military who kept deploying, who keep deploying under authorities written before they were even in high school, on families who said goodbye without knowing why or when it would end, on veterans who came home carrying wounds that don't appear on their medical charts, questions that nobody in Washington wants to answer. And that's where this story has always been going, which is how this story will end in episode 7. It's about that. It's about the human cost, the repeated deployments, the shattered families, the suicides, the quiet rage that settled into the bones of men and women who realized the war that they fought was sold on lies. We are going to center those voices, the ones that never made it onto cable news, and we're going to hold the ledger up to the light. And then we're going to do something that nobody else does. We're going to turn forward. Because if nothing changes, the next crisis will produce the next war. Different names, same playbook, same constitutional dodge. It requires action. And that's where Defend the Guard comes in. Not as a slogan, but as a constitutional reset. A practical line in the sand that forces Congress to do its job before citizen soldiers are sent into combat. This series, The Truth About Dick Cheney, is going to end with a choice. Accept permanent war as the price of doing business or reclaim the republic that was designed to restrain it. Cheney's legacy only survives if the system that empowered him survives with it. Stopping the next one starts now. So if this series has meant something to you, I need your help and make sure that it reaches people who need to hear it. Follow us on all the social platforms at Troops Home US. Like this episode, share it, drop a comment. The algorithms, they reward engagement. I'm sorry for asking. And every share puts us in front of somebody who hasn't heard it yet. If you're able, chip in a few bucks at bringourtroopshome.us/donate. We are a small veteran-led organization. We are fighting legislative battles in over 30 states. And every dollar keeps the work alive. And then finally, if you'll go to defendtheguard.us, read the mission, sign the petition, tell your state legislature that the National Guard belongs to the states until Congress does its constitutional duty. This fight doesn't happen without you. So thank you for listening. Thank you for standing with us. And I'll see you at episode 7.